question that has been haunting me of late is the question of value in relation to thought and intellectual work. It's the question of what matters, because our lives are very short. And so this question presses down if we are thoughtful. It's not good enough for me to merely engage in what I would call intellectual hedonism. Intellectual hedonism I would define as the act of pursuing intellectual work or thought, lines of reasoning, narratives that amuse a person. There is no objective consideration in the process. A person is essentially caught up by their own desires, their own interests, their own ambitions, and they do not think about what might be important. This is not good enough for me. And so I ask the question, what is important in thought? When does thought matter? What does that form look like? What does a thinking actor need to do in order to produce something that has value, something that has quality? The thinker is constantly thinking inside themselves. So the question then arises, when does the subjectivity of this activity enter into objectivity? When does my subjective act obtain to an objective value? I think I have found the beginning of an answer to this question. I obtain a value with my thinking when my thinking is able to offer explanatory power about the world, insight into the world, or some kind of knowledge that allows me to interact with the world. But I believe that it can be narrowed to an even more precise articulation. It seems to me that the thing that matters is logic. Now, when I say logic, oddly enough, logic is a term that covers a very broad amount of activities. When I say logic, I'm referring to premises, the creation of premises, the discovery of premises, the conclusion of premises that have accuracy and that have value in relation to existence. When I say value in relation to existence, this gets difficult because value in relation to existence can also refer to narratives which may not be logical, which is strange. But it is true that irrational narratives even superstitious narratives can end up functioning with value. This is true. When I refer to logic, I'm not referring to these pragmatic narratives per se, because even the pragmatic narrative must have a referent that makes contact with reality. The pragmatic narrative is not good enough on its own. We can only say that a narrative has value because we have some deeper understanding of truth that allows us to make this evaluation of value. When I say a deeper understanding of truth, I am not referring to abstract metaphysics. I'm not referring to idealisms, sweeping forms of idealisms that talk about idealist forms. When I refer to truth, I'm referring to an understanding about the nature of reality in which we exist. Examples that I can give of this right now. I am alive right now. This is a true statement. I am talking right now. This is a true statement. I am going to die one day. This is a true statement. We are on a planet in the middle of space, floating in a black void. This is a true statement. There are many true statements that we can make, and these true statements are what pragmatic theories presuppose, that undergird these theories, that give these theories the ability to declare their value. So when I talk about logic, I am talking about an understanding of authoritative premises that make statements about the nature of reality. Authoritative premises that are defensible, both rationally, both evidentially. And I think it is the pursuit of this truth that is the thing that carries the highest value. You see, I am so burdened. I realize that we are faced with so many different dilemmas at this point in our existence. We are assaulted by pluralism. We are confronted by pluralism. And the confusion is that we don't know what to do, and that we are confused about what meaningful thought looks like, about what meaningful intellectual work looks like. And I have sorrowed over this. I have sorrowed over this because I don't want to waste my life as a thinker. I don't want to be engaged in a form of thought that has no value. I don't want to be engaged in a form of thought whose value is merely a delusion. This is not good enough for me. I am discontent with these conclusions. And so I see that as thinkers, we are faced with this sea of confusion, of plurality. And we can engage in all kinds of different narratives. And engaging in these narratives not all of these narratives can be narratives of value. These narratives can contain value. They can contain hedonistic value. They can contain psychological value, existential value. But this is not good enough for me. And maybe it should be good enough for me. But I feel that my thought can do better. I feel that thought can do better. Because underlying all of these subjective narratives, there is once again the presuppositional connection with reality that gives us the authority to argue for the pragmatic value of these narratives, for the psychological value of these narratives. We show the lie of the subjectivity by classifying it, by contextualizing it. We could only do that if we were standing back from a vantage point and judging it from a position that had greater authority. And as I have thought about this burden of meaning in relation to thought, in relation to intellectual work, I believe that the answer is logic. And when I say logic, I am not referring to high-level, semantical, formal logic. I'm referring to more or less a metaphysical logic, and I don't even know if I want to say that. I'm referring more or less to foundational logical principles that lie at the base of all of our thinking, all of our meaning making. I'm talking about these principles, and I'm talking about continuing to work with these principles so that when we state something, when we produce a work, the work has power and it has substance precisely because our premises have power and substance. They are rationally authoritative and they are evidentially authoritative, meaning that they can be carried on through time with a higher level of accuracy and authority than merely engaging within the activity, within these subjective narratives. I understand that this is complicated because we are, in a sense, bound up in our subjectivity. But even in this, we are making the claim that we are bound up in our subjectivity, which is a negation of the idea that everything gives itself over to subjectivity. When does thought obtain to the act of meaning? When is thought fused with value? When does intellectual work have meaning? There are different ways to answer these questions. One way is to answer the question that thought has value, intellectual work has value, when it connects with other humans and gives these humans a sense of meaning. Psychological meaning, subjective meaning. This is indeed a form of value, but I am talking about a value that is stronger than this. The value that we get from someone like Aristotle when he talks about the law of non-contradiction and how inescapable it is. And no philosopher, no thinker, nobody can ever escape this law, because to do so would mean that they would have to give up their ability to escape this law. This is an example of thought reaching the highest level of value. It is an example of intellectual work reaching the highest level of value, declaring the necessity, the inescapable authority of the law of non-contradiction. This I see as a manifestation, almost like a revelation of light, as a guiding example of when thought is valuable, of when intellectual work becomes valuable. And the object is to try to obtain to this level of quality. And that is why I come back to logic over and over again, because it is the thing that matters. I'm surrounded by other thinkers who always try to convince me through narrative, through emotion. They do not try to reason. I almost never meet a thinker who reasons. They're trying to prove their position psychologically. I don't see them doing it rationally or logically. And that is what I am interested in. The world is full of these emotional thinkers that are incredibly persuasive, intimidating, and we can easily get caught up in their discourse, in their narratives, in their rhetoric, if we do not have the capacity to be logical, to be critical. If we have the capacity to be logical and critical, then we demand a rational demonstration. The narrative is not good enough. Derogatory dismissals are not good enough. We need to see premises of power. We need to see premises that have authority, premises that do not give way to a multiplicity of complex sophistry, but premises that are rationally and evidentially authoritative. We can stand on them. We can assert them. We can defend them. We can justify them. This is what seems to me is what is important in intellectual work, important in thought. What matters is when we arrive at insights of the highest authority. What matters is when we produce statements, premises, essays, books, documents that are full of authoritative premises. I did not say authoritarian premises. I said authoritative premises. This is a direction that I believe I have begun to find answers to this question. The question of what matters in terms of thought, what matters in terms of intellectual work. And the burden is great because if we are thinking, if we have a high capacity of criticism, a high capacity to be rational, to see through error, to refute error, it's hard to believe that this capacity, this skill, just suddenly becomes irrelevant and valueless in the world. I feel a burden because I feel that this capacity or this skill that we can cultivate, it has value, but it's difficult to figure out how to apply it, how to act within this ocean of pluralized confusion. And I think the path forward is to return to logic, is to begin to slice through the sophistry of our time. And I think the sophistry of our time is vast, so vast that we don't even understand it, so vast that we have been duped by rational narratives that have nothing to do with rationality, logical narratives that are not themselves logical. And we have lost the capacity, we have lost the ability to see through this error, to refute it, to crush it. And because of this, we end up in this ocean of sophistry that these sophists pull us into. And we are robbed of our ability to be able to swiftly and concisely refute. Because we do not see the underlying assumptions, performative contradictions that lie at the heart of all of this sophistry. This, I think, is the problem. And what this tells us about ourselves is that we lack skill in logic. We lack skill in reason. We lack skill in thinking because we're getting caught up in these emotional, irrational, rationalistic narratives. They are capturing us. They are persuading us because we do not have the critical skill to be able to identify the performative contradictions that lie at the heart of these narratives. We have lost the ability to be able to critique premises, to be able to think in terms of evaluating premises. We've lost it. And because of this, we end up in the same sea of sophistical confusion as everyone else. It seems to me that there is a revolutionary path that it's not just a return to Aristotelian foundations, but it is a more thorough, naturalistic, which is to say sane, humble, down to earth, non-idealized use or function of this logic. Something that has not entered into the world yet. Something that idealism is hijacked for itself. But something that naturalism has very likely failed to make use of. When I say naturalism, I'm really just referring to the reality that we exist within the material context that we do. Even if a metaphysician or an idealist wants to make a logical or a rational argument against the naturalistic context in which we find ourselves, this idealist still has to function within the confines and context of the authority of this naturalism. So what I am trying to convey is that I believe there is a new logic which is an affirmation of the old logic, but it is a more thorough and critical application of this logic in such a way that we are able to use it to navigate this tragic ocean of pluralist sophistry. We are all caught in the bind as thinkers of trying to figure out what thought has value and what intellectual work has value. And if we're not doing that, we're just engaged in hedonistic projects, and that is enough for some people. That is just not enough for me. It seems too tragic when the performative contradiction that underlies it destroys it and speaks of its lie. That is why it is not enough for me. I see something more authoritative at the base. And what is more authoritative is the reality of the power of logic itself to demarcate reality, to explain reality, to articulate reality, to expose and refute error. And I think that this is the direction where we find an answer to the question: when does thought obtain value? When does our intellectual work obtain value? It obtains value in the act of doing logic, in the act of refuting error. This, I believe, is the answer. Because if we do that, the rhetoric doesn't matter in a sense. It matters in that we still want to persuade and connect what is true to people. But it doesn't matter in the sense of the substance of truth. And when we get to this level of authority of the substance of truth, such as Aristotle had with the declaration of the law of non-contradiction, we get to a point where our thinking is immune to rhetoric. It is immune to narrative. It has the power and authority to withstand it. And we are looking for that type of thinking that has the ability to produce this type of thinking, to produce these type of premises or propositions of power, of logical, rational, evidential authority. We are looking for that kind of capacity within our thinking. And we are looking to be able to carry this into our work. This as the answer to what matters in terms of thought and what matters in terms of intellectual work. The ability to think logically, to think rationally, to refute error. And if we pursue this, and if we go down this path, then it seems that we are stepping outside the lie and the weakness of this intellectual hedonism. We begin to deal within the domain of knowledge, of authoritative knowledge. And I think that must be the answer at the end of the day, that what matters is when our thought and our intellectual work obtains to an understanding, or the clarification, or the articulation of actual knowledge.